Hello and welcome to Scottish Planner Live, a series of 10 short online sessions that is transforming what was the RTPI Scottish Annual Conference. We have been running those sessions over the course of this week, so we have had a number of sessions leading up to this point and a number of perspectives, with the whole week looking at how do we plan for the healthy places that we need across Scotland. Needed because despite for some of us experiencing improvements in health within our country, as a whole Scotland is trailing the whole of Western Europe in its record when it comes to health and healthy life expectancy. Today we'll be getting another perspective on that story, and we'll be looking at particularly around the area of how do we think about health, how do we think about what we're doing to enable health, while at the same time we are also looking at the targets that we have for carbon emissions across Scotland. So we'll be getting a reflection from Councillor Anna Richardson in Glasgow City Council on the work that she has been leading on in Glasgow, and how, although in many cases that and many other councils across Scotland are busy looking to see how they can meet their zero target emission for carbon emissions, what ways does that actually also, as a perhaps an unintended but preferably unintended consequence, also improve the opportunities for healthy lifestyles as well. We shall then also be getting another perspective around how do we look at this up the way, to look at it with more of a regional perspective, and I'll be joined by Anna Herriman from SESTrans to give us her perspectives on transport and movement when we start to look at how that scales up across a region and how we take account of that. Our week so far has been very focused around both process and the individual kind of areas where planning in particular can impact around health. I'm Irene Beautyman, and as Convenor of RTPI Scotland for 2020, it's been my passion for the year and in the time preceding up to that, because my own daytime role within both the improvement service, where we look to help local government in delivering on national outcomes, and in my other part of my role, which is at the moment with Public Health Scotland, looking at the role of place and planning in delivering on Scotland's public health priorities as well. So very much my passion. We've had a really interesting debate so far that sets us up to this point, really. The Minister giving full support for helping planning to get into a position to create healthier places, hearing from Public Health Scotland in their desire to work more closely with local government and to help that collaboration that is really needed, and to work around a set of themes and areas where we actually feel that differences can be made by planning and the environments they create. So very much about that circular thing of everything around place. Place is about that physical environment that as planners we shape with our day-to-day decisions, but as we know, we do that because of its impact on the people in the place and communities, and every place has a different set of people and communities. And then likewise that third element in every place being its economy, who's investing, who's working, and we all in different ways invest and work and contribute into an economy, and no more so that the public sector as well and their role. So that place-based approach, 20-minute neighbourhoods, have kept on coming up because in many ways, if we achieve the very best kind of environment to create healthy living, I think inevitably a 20-minute neighbourhood would certainly be one of the key elements of it. All of the sessions that we've had so far this week have been recorded and will continue to be, and at the end of this week everyone attending will get an email out saying with that link to those sessions. So if while you're listening you're thinking, oh crikey, I wish I could watch and catch up, or I wish so and so could see this and hear this, then by all means, keep in mind that you'll be getting that email out and you'll be able to do that. And likewise, if you've missed any of the sessions that we may refer to, you can also watch them on Catch Up, a really valuable resource given all the conversations that we've had. Finally, while we're having our presentations and our chat, we will have a Q&A box that will go up, so please feel free to submit questions there, and I will be pulling ones out. Depends how many we have. Apologies if there's a lot and I can't get to everyone. We shall do our best to just have a good conversation around that. So I think what I'll do is I'll begin my most challenging chat of this week, because both of our presenters are called Anna. So I can't say that I've actually worked out how I'm going to have to do Anna Glasgow and Anna SESTrans. I think that's how we'll do it. Forgive me, Annas, if that doesn't seem to work for you. I hope that's okay with you as well. So I will begin by asking Councillor Anna Richardson, who is with Glasgow City Council, to tell us and share with us what's been happening in Glasgow in respect of looking at active travel, that impact on carbon emissions, and that all-important link in, which has already been established in our conversations this week about how if we're doing something to deal with carbon emissions, then there are such strong links with everything that we do and its impact on health. Anna, I shall pass over to you. Many thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for that introduction, Irene, and I'm happy to be called Anna, whatever works for today. I'm really pleased that Irene invited me onto this panel today. In my role as Convenor for Sustainability and Carbon Reduction, transport is one of the topics that takes up a huge amount of my time, and never more so than over the last 6 months as we dealt with the challenges of lockdown. But I've also got a real interest in public health and how we can contribute to that through our transport planning. So today I'm going to touch on a few of the connections between transport, health and climate, both immediate and in the longer term. And I'd like to reflect on some lessons that I've learned over the past 6 months and what the pandemic's taught me about how we design our cities. So I want to begin fairly obviously with active travel. There's no need to go over the importance of physical activity for health. I'm pretty sure that's been discussed at length already over this week. We all know active travel is good, we all want to encourage it. But are we genuinely embedding this obvious form of everyday movement into all the places that we build? Because we're still not seeing walking and cycling being fully prioritised in all new developments. From brand new housing schemes that I've seen where pavements undulate to allow for driveway after driveway, to developments where cycle parking is not as prominent as the car parking spaces. And we still often see carriageway and footway, that's the way that we design our roads. But there's no visual prompt there that tells us this is a street that you can cycle on with your family, this is where you and your bikes belong. Of course, there are always exceptions to that. Car-free developments can be challenging, especially for local politicians and communities, but done well, they can begin to address the assumption that private car ownership is essential. Because I firmly believe that as we shape our environment, so our environment shapes us too. So what behaviours are we embedding in our neighbourhoods? Let's look at whether everyday journeys feel more convenient and safe by active travel. Is the healthy option the easiest? And if not, well, why not? Why are we allowing that? Low traffic neighbourhoods are gaining momentum and pushback across the UK at the moment. I see them as a key tool in relatively quickly rebalancing neighbourhoods to make the right thing an easier choice to make. And we're developing our first livable neighbourhood strategy to accelerate this direction of travel in Glasgow. And as with lack of physical activity, poor air quality is another threat to our health, and one that we have to a large extent created through our transport planning and built environment. In Glasgow, we have long recognised that. We're working hard to bring about change. And much of that work, such as our low emission zone, is about changing the impact of existing journeys, either through modal shift or by bringing on cleaner vehicles. But perhaps we need to be a bit more radical again and actively work to reduce the number of journeys that are being taken. And there can be no better time to do that than now. Because air quality has improved through lockdown, it was a small silver lining to a terrible and economically damaging event that continues to affect our daily lives. So how can we keep those benefits now? Because if we're eliminating many of those commutes and unnecessary journeys, it will be far quicker and more effective than replacing cars and buses with electric, although of course that's important and that work has to continue. So are we designing homes that people can work from comfortably longer term? And are we making sure that schools, shops and amenities are easily walkable from those homes? Do we need to start thinking about creating communities in which more of the residents will spend the majority of their time? And of course we can't talk about health without mentioning, of course, COVID and the direct results of that. It was a public health emergency that forced us to act in ways that we could never have imagined at the beginning of this year. Suddenly, mental and physical well-being depended on access to outdoor space and to local, easily accessible amenities. The huge surge in cycling that we've seen has demonstrated that it's only traffic and a sense of the roads being unsafe that is keeping people from considering better modes of transport. I think we all realised within days of the lockdown what many of us had always suspected, that we actually have huge amounts of public space even in densely populated cities, but we're squandering it on moving and storing cars. Our pavements are woefully inadequate while we're still socially distancing. It was okay at the height of lockdown when traffic had evaporated. We could all take to the carriageway on foot, scooters and bikes. But as quickly as the streets were taken over by people, they were given back when we didn't put in measures to lock in all that regained space. As local authorities with huge road networks, that's a lot of work for us to do. And in areas such as my own in the south side of Glasgow, the parks were packed in ways that you rarely see out with the occasional heatwave. Suddenly green space was hugely in demand, and while we have plenty of it here in Glasgow and we're very lucky with that, it seems as though there would never be enough for all of us. So if what we need in the middle of a crisis is to be able to walk, cycle and wheel, to be close to trees and greenery, and to make the most of our public spaces that enable us to feel connected even when we're staying apart, well, why wouldn't we want those exact same things during more normal times? And is that what we prioritise through every decision that we make? So what are the lessons that we can take from this year and apply to the climate emergency as well? So for those who aren't aware of our COVID transport response, we are currently working our way through £7.5 million of Scottish Government money through the Spaces for People project. And that was focused on enabling social distancing, ensuring safer active travel and supporting economic recovery for businesses, perhaps by giving them more outdoor seating space. We are bringing in school car-free zones around a lot more of our primary schools. We've put in pop-up cycle lanes and we've created more footway space and certain roads such as Kelvin Way have been closed entirely to enable people to move throughout that entire space free of traffic. I think what this project has shown us is quite how fast we can change a city and the way that that space is used if we have the permission just to go for it. The temporary nature of these works has been their strength. It liberated us to experiment in a way that we would never do with large public realm projects. Not all of it has gone as well as we would have liked, but I think that's okay, because if we don't make mistakes then we're not really innovating. And in these cases some of these measures may have to be amended or removed, and that is just part of a learning process that we all need to go through. We all know that transport is a sector where change takes time, quite often a really long time. So if we can do so much so quickly, then anyone can. I've described it as unclipping our wings and just seeing what happens. So we need to look at where other sectors have done the same and what planning could do as well to perhaps move at this new pace. Of course, these temporary measures have been a bit messy. We've been retrofitting into existing space and that's always difficult. It means taking things away, but without doing so, we never have the opportunity to build back anything better. I think what we've seen is that all the space we allocated to traffic just isn't pulling its weight anymore. So let's use that space differently. Let's add economic value or social value through parklets, meeting spaces and good public realm, which will become increasingly important to those who don't have the luxury of their own private gardens. Because we need population density if we're to meet our climate ambitions, to ensure sustainable transport is viable and to allow us to decarbonise heat networks at scale. But we also need to ensure that living close together is desirable and healthy. So how we use the space between buildings to benefit everyone is going to matter more than ever. And while we've been talking about the climate emergency since 2018, I think now we know how fast we can move in a real emergency. So no excuses about process and how we've always done things will stick now. As we emerge from the pandemic, we need to be decarbonising as quickly as we learn to socially distance. I certainly don't want us to go back to building a few new cycle lanes every couple of years, now that I know that the same team can build 30 kilometres in a matter of months, admittedly with different materials and a slightly lesser build quality. So where else do we have processes that were fit for the old world, but not for now? And finally, now we've seen what resilient communities look like in a crisis. Glasgow city centre emptied, and our local neighbourhoods have never been busier. Perhaps we need to move beyond city centres being the focus of our transport planning and look instead at the cross-neighbourhood journeys. Will we now reinvigorate local high streets thanks to a captive local audience? And does that make it easier for us to remove parking to make way for better pavements and cycling infrastructure on those very high streets? Transport's been turned upside down this year, both in terms of demand and provision. We have a huge opportunity now to learn from this period and to make positive change more quickly than may have been possible before. So it's time to think of whether what's worked during the pandemic will also make us and our planet healthier in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Anna. Great reflections on what's been happening in Glasgow and at the speed at which things can happen. I have to agree, in my place-based working, you suddenly realise that we really can get together and we really can collaborate when we need to. So I suspect we'll be referring back to this for decades, that, oh no, well, we managed it then, so why not now? And I would certainly welcome that. I'm going to go straight on into Anna Herriman, who is going to take that level of what is happening at a local level and bring that up and reflect on the impact regionally. Anna, I shall just pass straight over to you.
Thank you very much, and apologies, I turned on my microphone earlier and caused that feedback, so apologies from me. Similarly, really delighted to be invited to participate in this session. I love the topic about how planners can rethink transport to support health as well as climate challenges. And I'm promising to bring a regional perspective to the discussion. And I first want to just talk a little bit about cities, because we're living in an age where cities are growing. And we know from UN predictions that by 2050 we expect 68% of the world's population to live in urban areas. So as a benchmark, currently we're at 55% of the world's population in urban areas. So that brings the kind of challenges that we all deal with on a daily basis in terms of capacity, affordability of housing, and it brings us to a period of expanding city regions. So today what I would really like to talk about is this concept of expanding towns in city regions, and looking at considerations around how people move. I'd like to then go on and talk a little bit about how planning and transport can work together to support a shift from viewing people as owners of transport to viewing people as users of transport. And then finally, I'd like to just touch upon how we work together to bring together regional spatial strategy development and regional transport strategy development in Scotland, and how we make sure that we closely cross-reference these important pieces of work. So just in terms of placemaking and expanding towns, I was amazed how similar the points of view that I have on town development, out of town development, and Anna Richardson's points on city development. We really need good placemaking. We need new housing areas that can support and encourage sustainable travel behaviours. And it's absolutely critical right now in this period of town expansion and city region expansion that we explore this. We really need to think about this from the position of front door thinking. So what I would encourage all of us to do is to think about the choices that lead people to choose a form of transport as they hit their front door. And that's going to be, what's the weather like outside? What are my mobility choices? How do I feel today? But also really small, subtle things that we maybe don't always associate with transport. What's the size of the vestibule in this house? Is there a big cupboard for wellies? Really good outdoor, warm, wintry, waterproof stuff that you could ride a bike in or walk in? Or do you have to go to the garage to dig out all of that stuff before you start your daily journey? I think it's incredibly important that we think about this kind of the mobility needs of people from their home at all ages and stages through their life, and with all mobility needs. I think if we can encourage people to actively travel to nursery and school, that's going to influence later life choices around travel and positivity around the experience of active travel. And the key to that is thinking about new housing developments, as I said. So what kind of gardens are we providing? What kind of front paths? How big is the driveway? And very much like Anna Richardson was saying, what are the footways like? You know, are they interrupted? Do you have curvy streets where you can't see safely to the end of that street to a corner? Does it mean that your journey in your street from your front door to the main street is long and winding and longer than it needs to be, in fact, without clear sight lines and without signage? Is it an estate where there are discontinued paths, something that looks like a footpath that suddenly ends up with green that's extended from someone else's front of their house? So that confusion of public space, public realm, factored or private space is very discouraging in terms of adopting active travel at your point and choice of movement. And we need to work together to make sure that actually we think about that public realm environment that we're creating in new housing developments. And we also need to think about the rewards that we're providing people and the joy of active travel and walking and the wonder, and allow people to experience the natural world. So carefully avoiding too much municipal planting and allowing us to be a bit more kind of open-minded to the idea of mini forests that we're now seeing, supporting diversity, biodiversity right next to where we live, because this will be important for our health and well-being in the future. I have to say, when I changed to active travelling myself to work, which is a couple of years ago now, I was a bus user before, and my kids got to a certain stage where I thought I had a bit more time to ride my bike. Ironically, it took me less time to ride to work. But the big change for me was that I enjoyed my commute. I experienced the joy, and I want everyone to be able to experience that. So the other aspect of new towns and placemaking that I think we need to look at really carefully is, of course, around public realm at key places within developments. So near schools, near the co-op, near the high street, we need to make sure there's enough space for congregating. And I don't mean just in terms of physically distanced, but we need to encourage community cohesion, and we need to allow people to have license to be in these spaces for as long as they want to. And that means having adequate space, having seating, encouraging intergenerational use of these spaces, and from there we'll build community cohesion, which again leads to really important health and well-being outcomes for us, for all of us. We all need to be part of something bigger, and that's where it starts. I said I wanted to then go on and talk about how we view people as users of transport rather than as owners of transport. And I think this is an area where planning colleagues and transport colleagues can really come together and be a lot more creative. What we've seen working very well in city regions in the northwest of Europe is the introduction of mobility hubs. And this is creating, designating, safeguarding an area of public realm, and it can be in a city and it can be in a town, pardon me. But these are spaces where you can access shared transport, and that works most effectively where it's right next to accessible public transport. So it's allowing and encouraging people to utilise shared forms, whether it's an e-bike, whether it's a shared car. I know there are issues around that right at the moment with COVID-19. What's behind shared mobility is taking away the feeling and the pressure on people to buy a second car or to buy a car in the first place, and encouraging people to utilise more active modes of transport first, and then have access to more polluting forms if they need it. But you can provide so much more as a mobility hub. You can provide travel information, public transport information, e-bike and e-car charging, and you can provide access to drop-off points for parcel pickups, which allows us to minimise that sort of white van travel that we're seeing and worrying about in our communities and neighbourhoods with the rise of online shopping and deliveries. And the other aspect of thinking about people as users of transport is similarly around safeguarding space for modal interchange. So that's more space at train stations. And I know we're looking across Scotland at potential new train station sites. We're doing a whole lot of options appraisal work right across the country to see what we can do in terms of delivering new rail stations. And rail stations, of course, need a connection then between them and onwards to housing or to jobs or whatever. So creating the space around these stations for modal interchange is vitally important. It protects and safeguards public transport provision and also encourages greater mobility without a reliance on the car. Those things, again, really important for climate and I think for health. And finally, I think I really want to talk just on that point about the role of bus in the future and just touch on some recent thinking before I go on to talk about regional spatial strategies. In Scotland, for the past decade, we've faced significant declines in the use of public transport, particularly bus. We had a drop over a decade to 2019 of 100 million passenger journeys, which is extremely concerning if you value bus as a very important part of our transport network and as a way of moving people successfully without significant climate impacts and carbon impacts. And absolutely bus has a role to play, but bus has challenges and we need to work very carefully to make an environment where public transport is safe and is perceived as safe, safe to use. But we also need to think about where in rural areas and towns it's always going to be a challenge to bring around viability for commercial operators. Now, we have a range of options and some of them are around demand responsive transport. What we often talk about with demand responsive transport and what we often picture is a situation where you have a community transport provider which would be paid for by a council, taking the most vulnerable members of our community from door to door in journeys. But there's a lot of potential around the use of demand responsive transport. We can support community transport providers, given adequate kind of strategic thinking around their services, to acquire different kinds of permits where they can pick up, in addition to their door-to-door passengers, a few booked journeys from key pickup points on a road network. This enables us to tackle some of the issues in our less connected parts of regions across Scotland and connect people into the public transport network, again, really helping people not to have to rely on car transport, which is positive, but also supporting these small community transport providers who are providing some of the most vital services that are generally not really seen or focused upon. So there's this big question for us about the role of bus in the future. The other area where demand responsive transport might provide some really interesting opportunities is for commercial operators and the smaller commercial operators that we have right across the country. They generally operate on scheduled routes with scheduled stops, but with the addition of booking systems, back office booking systems, there is the potential for these operators to also pick up some scheduled journeys where they deviate a little bit from routes to set points. What it achieves is better viability for the operators and better value in terms of their use of the asset. So nobody would pretend for a minute that these approaches are going to create big profit margins. This is an area of transport where the margins are non-existent, and it's very hard to sustain. But if we can make better use of the assets that we've got, we can reinvigorate transport in some of our most disconnected parts of the regions and country. And finally, I just wanted to talk about how we work together as planners and transport professionals, thinking about strategic planning for the future and the regional spatial strategies that people will be thinking about in all parts of Scotland must link in with and align with regional transport strategies. These two pieces of strategic thinking need to work together. We cannot have a regional transport strategy that doesn't take account of land use planning and thinking around how we'll use land. And similarly, you cannot have a regional spatial strategy thinking about where we'll put new housing or where we'll put new job opportunities without thinking about the transport implications. So they're two separate pieces of work, but I think the opportunity and onus is on us to start to really engage in these processes as parallel processes, either using what's there as existing strategy or renewing strategies so that they answer to each other. One of the keys for us, if we're going to work together across planning and transport, I think, is to agree common outcomes and goals. And these outcomes, or objectives if you like, they're not about planning and they're not about transport. They're about people, and they're about health, and they're about well-being, and they're about quality of life and experience. It's about tackling poverty together. It's about increasing community cohesion. It's about making it easier for people to live their lives. And I think if we can agree what these objectives are in each region, what the big challenges are, then I think we'll start to bring these two really big discipline areas together to work much more collaboratively. And I'm excited about that opportunity. One of the other big challenges for us in terms of regional transport strategy and regional spatial strategy has absolutely come to the fore, not only in terms of city-region deals that we've been looking at right across Scotland, but also our responses to COVID-19. And there are very big questions now about how we better disperse or spread high-value economic opportunities, job opportunities across the country. Traditionally, we have put high-value jobs in cities, which creates a knock-on sense in terms of transport. And there's a great chance for us now to reinvigorate our thinking and look at the potential for smaller work hubs in rural areas, regional areas, which makes us question whether we need to travel to work at all, as well as creating opportunities through freight consolidation and better freight movement to support high-value jobs on a wider basis. And I would be remiss in talking about these two regional spatial strategies and regional transport strategies working together if I didn't again touch on public transport and some of the challenges there. And I think I just wanted to end this with my own thinking, which is that quite often we view the issues of congestion in cities and buses, the need to support bus and bus viability and improve bus priority coming into cities. We think of it from the city outwards, so we start to think of a band-aid approach. We think, right, we've got to deal with this congestion. And yes, we do. That's absolutely true. But actually what we're doing is we're forgetting that we're dealing with a symptom and that the cause was right back at the beginning, where people were making choices when they left their front door from their new housing or from their housing in semi-rural areas and in towns where they can afford to live. And they were making choices at that point about how they travel. So some of the challenges that we've faced around bus that are so important for us for the future come right back to that question of putting the individual at the very centre of everything we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both our speakers, and it was interesting there, Anna, because you took us up to the regional level, having started down at local with Anna Glasgow. We then came up to a regional level, but back down to that aspect around what is at your front door. I just wonder, within that, both of you mentioned that, you know, your background to this and your perspective coming into this is transport, which is what we wanted, because as a planning profession, that's what we need to be hearing, is that perspective. I wonder, for both of you, where do you feel that you would like to see transport and planning working more closely together? So I'll come to you first, Anna SESTrans. I shall come to you first. You mentioned about closer work on transport strategies, regional transport strategies, and the regional spatial strategies that all of Scotland is being asked right now to prepare in order to feed into our national planning framework. So those draft strategies are being prepared. There's final ones to come, but it's really going to be up there influencing our national planning policy for the next 10 years. So what would you, in your dream, see happening now to get that moving forward? And then likewise, Anna, in Glasgow, what would you like to see? And I know that Glasgow is doing a lot of work, so maybe just a little on that, but what more would you like to see planners on the line to be doing to actually get that link up a little bit more than you're already managing? So Anna, I'll go to you first on that kind of regional perspective on what we could be doing.
Thanks. First thing I think is to look at infrastructure first. So we need to have a plan for putting infrastructure in place at the get-go and at the outset. And that infrastructure really needs to follow the National Transport Strategy priorities and the National Transport Strategy's emerging hierarchy for investment. So it's putting active travel right at the top of infrastructure and our considerations around it. So when I say infrastructure, I don't mean building a new 4-lane road. I mean thinking about movement need and making sure that's on the ground. So that would be strategic cycle networks right across regions, developed prior to development of housing assets and employment assets, train stations delivered prior to development, bus turning circles and space safeguarded for mobility hubs and infrastructure exchange in the future, modal interchange in the future. So it's really about building what we need for people to move sustainably before everything else comes. And I think your other part of the question, Irene, was around what we would ideally see. Do you want me to come back to that or do that now? Okay, so I think it's going to happen, and I think we'll get there. But the ideal here is that NPF4 will reflect the regional spatial strategies and priorities identified, and that the trawl that Scottish Government has done around major development projects will match up with the strategic transport project review priority projects for the country. So we'll actually have real tie-in between the developments that nationally will help us grow and deliver a stronger and more sustainable economy, and at the same time we'll have that investment set aside for the transport needs to deliver that.
Thank you. It's interesting you were referring to the role of cities moving forward and it potentially not being the focus for all of the high value jobs, and that reminds me of a conversation that Anna we've had about Glasgow and what happens to our city centres if we end up with reducing the need for people and the desire for people to step out their door and even travel very far to begin with, that they can meet a lot of their daily needs within their own community. So another area there. Anna, in Glasgow, can you reflect on what more you feel could be done to link together transport and planning? We were hearing this morning that a good transport plan is a land use strategy. So that's just the sort of background that that those that have been listening to each session are coming from. I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, I think possibly the most obvious thing to me is that travel and transport and journeys aren't this fixed thing. We create demands for journeys, we create the need for journeys. Sometimes that's a positive thing, and sometimes it's really, really not. I think what Anna was saying just before about building in the sustainable transport networks before the people arrive. So you move into a new property or you start a family, and that's the natural first thing that you do is, oh, the train station's right there, or I can cycle all the way to the nursery. So it's embedding those things from the very beginning, I think, is really important. So embedding those good habits, and as I said earlier on, making the right choice, the easiest one, the most obvious one, the one that environment that's been built tells you is the right thing to do. And there's very little, I think, at the moment within our built environment that tells us that getting up, getting on your bike and going to work or the shop or school on your bike is the normal, most logical thing to do. So we're missing that visual cue, I suppose, in what we see around us. But I think the most effective thing we can do, and I was touching on it in my earlier presentation around trip generators. So we can change each journey into a bike ride or an electric bus, or we can just cut half of those out because we don't need to do those journeys anymore, or they're very local and easy to us, and that's exactly what comes back to your 20-minute neighbourhood, to a working from home for many of us, although obviously only certain sectors of society have that ability to change the location of their work. But for those of us that do, we create more space out there for those that are travelling and need to travel. So I'd be really keen to see when we design parts of our city or design our towns, that we don't assume that journeys will just have to happen. They won't. They only happen because we make people live in one place and have their needs met elsewhere. We can choose not to make that necessary for them. And I think in the most resilient neighbourhoods that have worked well and that have had strong communities coping well with COVID, they've been the ones where a 5-mile rule actually didn't impinge upon them meeting any of their needs. It just wasn't an issue because everything they needed was there and could be accessed, and that's something that should be available to absolutely everybody, not just those who are fortunate to be in certain types of neighbourhoods.
Thank you. I always feel aware that simply putting in the infrastructure for walking and cycling, if the distance that you have to go to get to anything is so immense, then it doesn't matter if it's the best infrastructure in the world. You'll choose not to use it because it takes so long to actually get to something. Yep, I'll come to you, Anna. Herriman.
Yeah, it would be terrible if we did this session and I didn't mention e-bikes and distances. I would never forgive myself. So I think you're absolutely right, but e-bikes are revolutionising the way people choose to travel. And like I said, if you've got your wet weather kit and it's to hand and it's easy, and you've got a charged up bike, there is really nothing to stop you from doing much longer distances. So what we're seeing in European city regions is people regularly commuting, and yes, commuting maybe is a thing of the past, who knows, but of distances of what equate to about 15 miles quite comfortably, and arriving, sometimes dropping kids off and cycling under the wet weather gear in their work clothes. So it's really transforming the way that we can think about active travel. And I think, if I forgot to say it in my presentation, I just had to put my hand up so that I didn't kick myself later.
No, I think it's a very valid aspect. I'm aware of people who would never have cycled to work, but having got an e-bike are now actually making that a daily activity, or were making it a daily activity. It brings us round a little bit to also what's in the Q&A there about workplaces being ready for us. Yes, there'll be a lot of us that will continue on to work from home, but there are always those that will not be able to. And I do wonder when we think about bikes, and especially when we think about e-bikes, what the facilities are to park that rather expensive bike and go into work or go into a mobility hub or whatever. Is there something there around as we look at changes in the environment that we create the really safe and secure places to leave that property, if you're not just walking, that you can actually leave your bike somewhere very, very safe? Is that something that I don't know if Glasgow has thought about that, or if what you're aware of happening in the SESTrans area? I'll go to Anna Richardson first, and then to Anna.
Thanks. Yeah, certainly in terms of facilities, I think what Anna was saying there around we don't actually need as many changing facilities and showers as perhaps we think we do, depending on how far we're cycling. But certainly I've always cycled to work quite happily and rolled straight into committee, and everything's been fine. But the real barrier is the safe storage, and if I didn't feel that my bike was safe, I wouldn't want to leave it there for 6, 7, 8, 9 hours a day. And that's something that we really need to be pushing employers on. I think it's something that, when I was saying that we encourage active travel but we don't embed it, that's exactly the type of thing that epitomises, you know, you can cycle into work if you want, but good luck, hope your bike's okay. And certainly over lockdown, from what I saw on Twitter especially, a lot of medical professionals were losing bikes because they were being stolen outside hospitals, which is just, you know, mind-boggling, and yet, you know, shows how we don't protect that absolutely essential vehicle. Now, if, you know, if members of staff are losing their only mode of transport, you're going to have an issue as an employer. I think perhaps in terms of a little bit of a push to speed that process up, I'm really interested in exploring a workplace parking levy, for example, and those types of carrots and sticks. So we push employers to reduce the amount of unsustainable commuting that their employers would do, and that encourages them then to do some to make it easier for people to make the right choices so they don't need those parking spaces. So that's something that we're very keen to explore as part of our transport strategy work. Certainly.
Thank you. I'm aware, you know, active travel plans are something that are required in applications, in planning applications, but I don't know just, you know, is there a need to almost refresh that and to be asking for a little bit more in that, and that it look far more at the kind of facilities that are there when we actually arrive at places of work, or we arrive at any of those amenities that we're not always reaching on a daily basis and maybe just nipping in and out, but the ones where we really need to actually park something securely for a number of hours without any kind of supervision from ourselves. Anna, I'll pass to you. Herriman.
It happened. Yeah, I just picking up. I think that there is a huge opportunity for us if, you know, if workplace parking levies came in. I think that's another source of income that can be fed into the system to support more sustainable modes of transport and more support for public transport. My background, of course, Irene knows, but others won't. I worked for 18 years in City of Edinburgh Council, so I fully can understand where that comes into play, where the workplace parking levy can support active travel. But I suppose the other thing is just around employers and the mobility options that they're providing for their staff. Those who have parking spaces, how much of that can they give over to shared transport or to people who've carpooled? If they are creating space for bike users, remember that some people have adaptive bikes, so be quite broad-minded about what bike travel might look like. Some people have cargo bikes, but also just think about the users and the profile of the people that will be parking, and they want safety for their bike. They also want safety for themselves. So, you know, on a dark night, you want it to really be well lit, and again, kind of with good visibility from wherever the bike parking is located to key transport routes and links. So there's huge potential there. I think it's easier where there's more land to start to add these kind of elements to workplaces, and possibly more challenging in city centres. But again, it's about how we think about space, and if we're clear from National Transport Strategy to what our priorities are, and we apply that thinking across the whole, then there's not much justification for giving more space to car parking, really.
It's been a theme that has come through a lot about road reallocation. If we want to create more space in our towns and our cities, then the biggest user of space in our towns and cities is actually roads and parking, and allowing, and we were hearing earlier this morning that car ownership is going up, but actually the number of miles driven has gone down. but that doesn't help because people are still storing their car on a public road and taking up very, very valuable space, especially when you get into an urban environment. I'm looking at the question that's come through about budgets, and that there's something here when we're looking about how we connect up planning and putting in infrastructure first, is that planning doesn't always have that teeth to ask for infrastructure first. It asks for, you know, developer contributions, and it can manage those and look to do that, but that can be an issue for it. What is the transport experience of that, of trying to get that infrastructure in first, and what could planning be doing around new developments a little bit differently, and how could transport help with that? Could transport be more helpful in saying, look, we need this up front, it has to happen like that, and be more supportive? And then also, I'll put that to Anna Herriman, but Anna Richardson, I wondered if you could say a little about some thinking on parking standards and maximum parking standards within new development as well, because I know that's something we've chatted about, and it's very much a planning issue. But Anna Herriman, I'll go to you first with that aspect around how do you put infrastructure in first when there isn't the money sitting there in planning authorities, certainly, or frequently in councils, to be able to do that.
Yeah, I suppose it's really how we structure the whole system, isn't it? It is very, very challenging. I think that place briefs are our starting point, which allow us then to decide what planner recommendations are to committees, because if developments are adhering to those briefs, then I think it's easier to recommend approval. But the brief has to be absolutely clear about the role of mobility and movement. It's not about buildings, it's about the people that will use them and how they use the buildings and the space in between them and the public realm. And I think that shift is really, really important. It doesn't necessarily guarantee then that you're going to get the level of developer contributions, but again, I think this is something about strategic funding. So for years, we've looked at transport funding as piecemeal project funding to develop X amount of road or X amount of cycle path or whatever, and we've just chunked it up like that. Actually, if we zoom up to a regional level here and we say, regionally, we need these networks, and these are actually strategic transport projects in themselves, which we also need developer contributions to, then I think we start to flip it and take it up a level and say, right, we're really, really serious about this. This is a very major commitment which we all have to make. I don't for a minute dispute the challenges of funding within any individual council authority, or even at the moment within Transport Scotland, because the additional pressures that we're dealing with at the moment are felt everywhere. But again, there's the cost of not doing it, and we don't always express that. So I think what we're trying to do now with all strategic planning is take a 20-year view to 2040. And by the way, I have no idea how we'll be moving in 2040. That is a complete crystal ball scenario. We don't know, but we need those long horizons, because we need to be thinking really strategically. So I guess it's not a perfect answer to the question, and I acknowledge the challenge, but if we zoom up and we say, strategically, what we want is a fully networked, active travel set of routes between villages, towns, settlements, into cities, into modal interchange points. And if this is a strategic transport project for the country, then I think we'll get there.
Lovely, thank you very much. Anna Richardson.
Can I just agree with everything that was said there? And before I talk about parking spaces, just add in that this approach of getting infrastructure done as we're developing is something that we're very much looking at doing across the north of the city, from Sight Hill, which is a huge redevelopment, and then further out from there we have been designing up and looking at how we can build the cycle network in. And while it's challenging, we're fortunate that City Deal enables us to match funds and to to bring in a lot of active travel funding, which is there, and it is a funding stream that, you know, out of a lot of difficulties that local authorities face, at least when it comes to active travel, we still have money coming in from the government and we can do positive things. And there's got to be something a lot easier about building it in from the beginning rather than trying to retrofit, which is where a lot of the expense and the engineering difficulties come from. So being able to build it in from the start is got to be more cost effective in the first place. In terms of the parking spaces question that you had there, Irene, I did mention it at the beginning, but I think quite often, while we want to do the right thing on these, on minimising the number of parking spaces in developments, certainly when we're filling in gap sites within established residential areas, part of the hurdle there is the unease from elected members, from the existing community, which I completely understand, because they will be asking, why are you bringing extra people in, which is, I would argue, the very positive thing in terms of keeping local services going. We want thriving communities, but I can understand why there is that anxiety about that they'll just put their cars onto roads that streets that are already full. So I think in terms of policy, you know, planners can be strong on that, but they certainly do need to make that case, and to try and tackle that chicken and egg issue of communities will say, well, we'll give up our cars once you build the infrastructure, but we need to be taking some of that car space away to build that infrastructure. And all of us that represent communities have, I think, a role to play there in guiding our communities through that difficult transition, because it's painful before it gets better, and that is tough. But that's something that we all have to, you know, be passionate about and want to do. I think that's how we start to get over the hurdle around the difficulties of car-free developments, or having a much tighter.
Thanks, and that brought us on to something we were discussing this morning, and I think it would be helpful. I've got a question there about cycle parks. So hold on, I have it written. Could Glasgow or Edinburgh pilot a cycle park that provides facilities and equipment for users? I suspect that's maybe part of your mobility hubs that you were talking about earlier, Anna. But also, I wonder if we could close with just that very thing that we have seen and that you've both alluded to, is that the reaction of members of the public to that very precious thing called their car getting, and the space for it getting impacted upon. When we discussed it this morning and what approach could help with that, it was very much about it's the same folks who come out with that who feel very strongly about it, and that perhaps we don't get that message out clearly enough that this is actually to create space for everybody and to actually help reduce inequalities. I wondered what your thinking was on that, and whether we could be changing that messaging a little bit more, and then also just your thoughts on a cycle park, what you think about the creation of parks like that in order to improve the facilities. That's final question, so really just a minute each. We're running out of time, as we always do. I shall go to Anna Herriman and then Anna Richardson.
Okay, as quickly as I can then. Changing messaging, hugely challenging. I think I mentioned this to you, Irene. My term for the fact that cars keep getting bigger and bigger is that they are in their extinction phase. We're in the extinction phase of petrolhead, and right at the moment, so they're not going to like what I'm going to now say. But yeah, it's a hugely challenging message, because you cannot make someone who is diametrically opposed to something agree with you if their reasons for seeing things so differently are just never going to take into account what you're trying to say. But the message here is, and I hope they're not going to be too angry, we've got loads of park and ride sites. We've got loads of multi-storey car parking. Those places can provide charging facilities, they can provide showering facilities. They are safe, they can be lit, they have staff connected to them. There is nothing to stop us from rethinking the amount of space we're giving for private paid-for parking, and finding some way of working in partnership with these car park owners and rethinking the amount of kind of facility that we're providing for active travel.
Thank you, and finally to Anna.
Thanks. In terms of the debate around we need to take 4 parking spaces away to do this on your street. We're never going to win that, because if we're talking about what we're taking away from people, that's just, you're just going to lose, and there's nothing, and I can understand that. And actually, if somebody came and said they're taking my parking space away, even I would be a little bit unhappy about that. So we need to change the conversation. The conversation we need to have with our people, with our communities, is how do you want to live, and what kind of community do you want, and what kind of city do you want? Do you want clean air? Do you want us to deal with climate change? Do you want your kids to be safe? Do you want your grandmother to not feel at risk if she's crossing the road? Do you want to have a peaceful community? Do you want to feel connected to your neighbours? If the answer to those questions is yes, then great, we've got a mandate. At that point, we say, let us use the evidence-based tools that will achieve all those outcomes for you. And then we'll not talk about the parking. But if the parking disappears, because we need to put all those other things in and do all those changes, in the long run, everybody gains, whether they were unhappy about the change or not. I think COVID has shown us that we can complain about change, but humans adapt really, really quickly. And let's use that as a positive thing. We can adapt to whatever we're given, to whatever happens to us.
Fantastic.
Let's do the same.
Great point on which to end. That don't we realise now we really can adapt if we need to. So that's a fantastic point to end. I thank you both Annas, both Anna Herriman from SESTrans, Councillor Anna Richardson from Glasgow. Thanks everyone for listening in. Shirley Curran, your questions have kept us going. I think you should have joined us on the panel, but maybe next time. Thank you all, and go safe. Bye bye.